There's no amount of incentives that the government can give us or anything else that is going to continue to make farmers do this or encourage them to do this. So it has to work economically apart from incentives, apart from government programs and things like that. So just real quickly, I want to go through just a few economic things, big picture things, and then as Zeb and the others, as we talk later on, we can reference back to some of these things because these principles are going to work. It's just like the soil health principles. You know, the principles of soil health work everywhere, but there's different ways that you have to implement them to get them to work on your particular operations. And it's the same way with these economic principles. So before I get into that, just a little bit of background. We farm in south central Nebraska. We've been no-tilling there for more than 30 years. We're farming around 2,000 acres. We're about half dry land. And dry land for us is about 25 inches of rain. You know, and just like you guys, it can vary widely. You know, some years that's 15, some years that's 40, but 20, 25 on average. And the other half, we have pretty good irrigation water on some farms. Nebraska has a lot of irrigation. I think almost every center pivot in the country is made right there in Nebraska. So we're blessed with that, and we're blessed with good soils. We've got some pretty good, fairly deep silt loam soils, so we do have good soils. Typical rotation in our area is corn and beans. Sometimes beans and corn. Sometimes corn and corn, but most people aren't doing much other than that. Now, we are trying to diversify, and so we're doing multiple seed crop, cover crop seeds, so we're growing buckwheat and sunflowers and rye and barley and things like this, but corn and beans is still the base of what makes things work out there. And we've been doing cover crops for about 15 years now. I show this picture because this is what we want our fields to look like. Didn't always used to be that way. You know, we used to want to be able to see, you know, look like a nice tilled garden. But our vision of what looks good has changed. And that's one of the things, you know, as your mindset changes, your envisioning of what is a beautiful looking field changes as well. So now our goal, we don't want to see our soil unless we go looking for it. So I want to have to pull back that residue in order to see my soil. And so we're not running any row cleaners. We're just slicing through with double disc openers and putting that right in. We give up a little bit of precision. We give up a little bit of the stand. But in our environment, with limited rainfall, you know, having that cover later in the summer, we were talking about the soil temperature difference, it can be huge. And from a moisture saving standpoint, this is huge for us. Back in 2009, we started green cover seed as a response to some experiments that we did with cover crops, what we saw them doing in our fields. And the number one thing that we were concerned about was would they use too much moisture? So we did some experiments and we saw that when we used a diverse mix of cover crops, 6, 7, 8, 10 different things mixed together, our water use efficiency was so much better than when we were planting anything by itself. And that was the hurdle that we had to get over, because most people in our area, and in a lot of areas, they're going to say, I don't have enough moisture to grow one crop. How am I going to grow that crop into cover crop? Typically, that's not your problem here where you get 60 inches of rainfall, but still in drought times, you know, that can be a concern. But we saw the power of diversity in these diverse mixes, and that's what gave us the encouragement to start green cover. And so it's been a fun ride since then. So everything that you see here, this is our main headquarters in Nebraska. We do have a second location in southeast Kansas now, but everything here has been built since 2011. That was a piece of farm ground. We weren't really smart enough to build it on a nice paved highway, you know, with good access. We just kind of built it in our backyard because I guess we didn't really stop to think that it might grow and get big. So we currently have about 60 employees now across the 2 locations, and we're shipping seed to all 50 states and, you know, shipping enough seed to cover over 1 billion acres. This is why we get up every morning. This is our mission statement. We want to help people regenerate, steward, and share God's creation for future generations. And that's why we put a lot of money into developing these resources, like that resource guide that you've got there. We do a lot of webinars, podcasts, we do conferences, we do lots of things. I taught for 10 years before I came back to the farm, so education is really important to me, and it's really important to us as a company as well, because people will make good decisions when they have good information. I really believe that. Farmers will make good decisions when they have good information. And so that's part of our goal, is to help them get good information so they can make those good decisions. So, how do these soil health practices, cover crops, no-till, using biology, diverse rotations, all these different soil health practices, how does that impact economics? Because, in these times, that's top on everybody's mind. Zeb and I were talking earlier about, your cotton production out here might be break even at best, and that's, corn and beans, guys, the cattle guys, they're looking fat and happy right now. Okay, it didn't used to be that way, but they're the ones looking fat and happy, and everybody else, maybe we can break even, maybe we can eke out a little bit. So economics is first and foremost on everybody's mind. And there's three ways, and this isn't just with soil health, but there's three ways that you can become more profitable in your farming operation. And I'm going to just briefly touch on these three ways and talk a little bit about soil health can play into that. And then as we have the rest of the talks, the rest of the conversations as we're touring Zeb's farm this afternoon, we can talk about these three. You may not be able to utilize all three of these. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But you will have opportunities to utilize some of them. And they're just real simple. There's nothing rocket science about this. So the first way you can become more profitable is just simply to lower your input costs. Lower your input costs. Because we're not, when we're not making a profit, a lot of times it's not because we're not growing crops. It's just because it costs as much or more to grow them than what the value of that crop is worth. And so one of the ways is to lower input costs. And I believe this is the number one way that soil health practices can lead to more profitability. And, there's thousands of examples of people doing this all the time. And so we can't get into a lot of the details here. I'm going to share just a few things that we see are kind of the low-hanging fruit with farmers. We see this on our own farm, and we see this with a lot of our customers as well. But when we use biological processes, we can reduce the need for synthetic inputs. And so I believe that's the number one way that we can use soil health practices to lower our input costs and increase the profitability of our operation. So just a couple of examples. Nitrogen, as an industry, U.S. agriculture, we spend $5 billion on nitrogen fertilizer. $5 billion. That's a lot of money. And if you look, at your, spreadsheet of your expenses to grow a crop, nitrogen, fertility in general, is going to be one of the biggest costs. But 78% of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. Above every acre of crop ground in Nebraska, in North Carolina, and everywhere else, you have 30,000 tons, not 30,000 pounds, but 30,000 tons of nitrogen sitting above every acre of crop ground in the U.S. And so the goal is to try to figure out how can we make that available to the plant. Because nitrogen in the atmosphere is held as dinitrogen. See, it's N2. So it's two nitrogen molecules, and they're tied together with three sets of covalent bonds. They're bonded to each other, and it makes them completely inert. Which is good, because if you've ever had a whiff of anhydrous or ammonia or anything like that, you know what that can do to the human body. And every year people die from anhydrous accidents. It can kill you. So the dinitrogen is kind of nice because we want to live. We don't want our insides to melt. But just as it's completely inert, every time I take a breath, I'm taking in 78% nitrogen. It does nothing to my body. That plant is taking in all that nitrogen as well. and it can do nothing with it. It's completely inert to the plant also. And so that's why we have all this nitrogen in the atmosphere, but our plants can be nitrogen deficient because of that. But what takes man $5 billion to build these factories to convert that, and actually, when you're buying nitrogen fertilizer, don't think of it as a fertilizer expense, think of it as an energy expense, because the money you pay for nitrogen is not for the nitrogen, it's for the energy that it takes to get it into a form that your plants can use. But God has given us these little organisms that do the same thing. So these rhizobia bacteria, soybeans I know is a big crop out here, just like in Nebraska, so we're very familiar with rhizobia and what they do for a soybean plant and how they can form these nodules. And they're actually breaking that nitrogen molecule apart and making it available. So don't ever tell people, why I grow soybeans, they make their own nitrogen. And that's not true. The plants aren't doing it, it's the bugs, it's the bacteria that are doing it, but they don't do it unless the soybean plant feeds them carbon in order to make that work. And so that's great for soybeans. We're not paying for nitrogen fertilizer for our soybeans, but what about the other crops? Well, there are other organisms. It's not just rhizobia that has a superpower of being able to split that nitrogen, that dinitrogen bond. There are lots of other things. They're called free-living diazotrophs. They're single-celled organisms like Azospirillum and Zotobacter and Bacillus and Cyanobacteria. There's all these other organisms out there that when you have them active and working in your soil system, they can do the same thing that rhizobia are doing and make that nitrogen available to the plants in exchange for the plants feeding them liquid carbon that they're making through photosynthesis. Because these organisms have a superpower of making nitrogen available, but they can't live on that. That's not their food source. That's the food source for the plants. The food source for these organisms is carbon. And the only thing that can make carbon in the system, make carbon available, is the plants through photosynthesis. So, knowing this, we think, well, why can't we just go dump bucket loads, truckloads of this stuff out there ahead of our corn or cotton and then stop putting nitrogen fertilizer out there? Well, the difference is these guys are incredibly productive. If you're growing, and I know you guys said you had some 70 bushel soybeans here, if you're growing 70 bushel soybeans, that takes 350 to 400 units of nitrogen to do that. Now, nobody's going to grow soybeans if you had to put 400 units of nitrogen out there. But rhizobia can make that in about 60 days. Incredibly powerful, incredibly efficient, because there's trillions of them in this little nodule all working together to do that. These guys, single-celled organisms, not nearly as productive. They're going to make 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. So is that enough to grow a big corn crop? Not in our area. But is it enough to offset some of the nitrogen that you would typically put out there? Is it enough to really help your cover crop get off to a good start, and then you keep that nitrogen in the system and you cycle it? Is it enough to do a forage crop if you've got livestock? Yes, to all of those. So I'm not saying that we can completely replace all of our synthetic nitrogen with utilizing things like this, but we can certainly reduce it. So the combination of having legumes in our cover crop mixes, like when we're going to see some hairy vetch and crimson clover this afternoon, that is making nitrogen through that rhizobia, but I suspect that Zeb probably has some populations of these things out there as well that are working to make nitrogen available for that system. So that's to me, that's just one of the lowest hanging fruits, because we spend so much money on nitrogen fertilizer, and so much of that doesn't even get into our crop. It ends up in the water systems. And I don't know about you guys here, but we've got huge nitrate issues in our water. The groundwater in Nebraska. Nebraska is not a surface water state. We're largely a groundwater state. But Hastings is we have good water where we're fairly clean, not high nitrates, but 30 miles north, Hastings is the bigger town, 25,000 person town. They're looking at spending millions of dollars to have to put in a reverse osmosis system for drinking water in the community, because there's so many nitrates in the water. Because it's sandier soil, water table is high, and it's just a problem in a big area. Okay, but it's not just nitrogen where we can see some of these savings, where we can reduce some of these inputs. There's all these other things as well. When you look at the composition of your soil, by volume it's 45% minerals, but by weight, it's probably 98% of your soil weight is made up of minerals. And so it's all these things that plants need. Now nitrogen comes from the atmosphere, so that's not native as part of your soil, but phosphorus and potassium and calcium and magnesium, iron, manganese, boron, right on down the list. These are the minerals that your soils are made up of. And we just have to unlock them to make them available, because we're spending money putting a lot of these things in, but it's already in your soil. But just like God didn't create plants to pull the nitrogen directly from the atmosphere that goes through the biology, He didn't create these plants with root systems that can directly access all of those minerals in the soil. It has to go through the biology as well. And so when you look at a test, this is what a typical soil test would look like. This is from Ward Labs back in our area. So when we send in a soil sample, they're going to tell us, okay, I've got 23 pounds of nitrogen, I got 35 parts per million of phosphorus, I've got 436 potassium, and so on down the list. This is just showing me what's available to the plant. This is showing me what the plant can see and what the plant can get, but it's a very small percentage of what's actually there. If you want to do something kind of fun, if you have never done this, it's worth doing a few of these, total nutrient digest tests. They will tell you what is completely in your soil, whether it's available to a plant or not. And it's really interesting. So this is again, Ward Labs, they're just in our backyard, not very far from us, so we use them a lot. But they analyzed 68 soil samples using this test from Midwest soils, and this is just from 6 inches. So this is how much is in the top 6 inches of your soil, not 4 feet where your roots can grow, 6 inches. 878, and these are in pounds, this is not parts per million. I have 878 pounds of phosphorus in my top 6 inches, 3,700 pounds of potassium, 8,600 pounds of calcium, and right on down the list. We have enough minerals in there to grow crops for thousands of years. We just have to unlock them. We have to get them to a state that is available for plants to use. And again, the way that we do that is through biology. So there are organisms like mycorrhiza fungi, which the mycorrhiza, these are arbuscular mycorrhiza, so there's these little round black things, those are the arbuscles. They actually grow inside your plant roots. And then they send this hyphal network out, that's this little spider web looking thing. And these hyphae can actually, this is a piece of feldspar, think of it as a little tiny piece of sand. They actually can chemically bore, it's like little microscopic mine shafts, into this solid rock material, and they're extracting, not everything, but they're extracting what the plant needs and what the plant is calling for. Don't ask me how they do it. Even scientists, we're just now being able to see that they're doing it, but we don't completely even understand how they're doing it yet. But these mycorrhiza can pull the minerals that the plant is requesting out of the mineral portion of your soil, and it just travels back through this hyphal network, and it feeds it directly into the plant. In exchange, the plant has to give them carbon. The plant has to feed them carbon because they can't eat these minerals. These fungal organisms can't eat the minerals. They have to have the carbon. So it's a beautiful system that God created. We just have to figure out how to kind of put things back to the way they were intended. And that's the number one way that we can reduce our inputs. And I'm not saying eliminate these synthetic fertility inputs, but we can certainly reduce them. And you can't do it all at once. I'm certainly not up here advocating just, go out this spring and cold turkey, cut off all your nutrient supply. That would be foolish. But you should be looking at how can I reduce. And every time, especially with the equipment that we have nowadays, it's so easy on most of our application equipment to do different trials. So if you're typically putting 150 units of nitrogen out there, it's pretty easy to make an adjustment from the cab. Put a strip out there where you only had 100. Put a strip where you put 200, and then keep track of those. And you can pretty quickly tell if you've got too much, the right amount, or I didn't put enough on. And that way you can just always be zeroed in on that. In our area, there's a new company called Sentinel Irrigation, and they are utilizing satellite technology. They've got the right algorithms now. So from the satellite photos, you plant a strip of over-fertilized corn, and so that's going to be as green as it could possibly get. And then you do your normal rate, and then you do, they call it a canary strip, which is like 60 pounds less than what you would normally do. And then based on the color of that, they can tell if you need more or less nitrogen. Now, if it needs less, you can't do much about that, but the system is designed to spoon feed the nitrogen through the pivot throughout the growing season, but based on the color of those plants, they can tell you how much nitrogen you need to put on. So typically they're showing 30 to 40 pounds of nitrogen less than what guys would do just in a normal program. So again, that's significant money saving. So this would be one of the easiest ways for us to do this. You know, I'm sure that Zeb's going to talk about some of the ways that he's using this in how on his own farm, and then we'll look at it when we get out there. So number two. So number one is to reduce those input costs to become more profitable. Number two is to increase your yields. That's another way to be more profitable. Grow more stuff to sell without adding a lot of extra cost of production. Because we can typically always grow more, but can we grow profitably? And so how do we use soil health to increase our yields without significantly increasing the cost of production? I don't know. I mean, this is a challenge. People are doing it. Now, I don't know what the added costs are, but just a couple of slides here, again, to get us thinking. This is from the National Cover Crop Survey that SARE and ASTA do every year. And this may, I don't know how many people from North Carolina participate in this survey, but I know there's some, but a lot of this is probably from the Midwest. But basically, they do this survey every 5 years, I think they've been doing it, and so they get farmers to respond. But here's what's interesting. It says the farmers with 10 or more years of cover crop experience had yield gains of 6% on soybeans, 6% on corn, but those with only 2 years or less of cover crop experience had soybean yield gains of only 3%, half as much, and corn yields that weren't a lot different. And so we can increase our yields, but we don't see that necessarily in year one or year two. These are cumulative, they're compounding, they're cascading benefits that you're going to see with using cover crops, with using these soil health techniques. And so when you stick with it, as you start building your soil organic matter, as you start building that nutrient cycling, you build those populations of the Zotobacter and Azospirillum, these organisms that are making the nitrogen available. You're building up your fungal populations to do that nutrient release. You start seeing those compound and cascade as you go. So can we increase yields using these things? The answer is yes, but we can't necessarily expect to see these huge yield jumps in year one. And so that is, I think that a lot of people say, yeah, I think I probably have seen that on my own farm, but we can increase our yields. And in fact, I had to throw this in here. Russell Hedrick, many of you I'm sure know Russell. Now, I can tell you that he is not trying to do this on every acre every year, because this did add a lot of expense. But I think it's fun that he did set the dryland corn yield record, 459 bushels. And he used a lot of regenerative principles. Now, he's using a lot of all kinds of inputs to do this. There's no doubt about that. And he will tell you that this is not what he's saying everybody should do, because it's just simply not as profitable as what he would like, but it is what is possible. Lisa?
You're your time.
Oh, I thought you had a comment.
No, sir, I'm just giving you a 5.
5, okay. I thought maybe you had a great comment.
You can have some of my time.
Okay, yes, thank you. So anyway, yes, we can grow really good yields using these principles and practices. You just have to figure out how to integrate them in, what works in your operation. Where can you pull back? Where do you need to increase? You know, it's as much of an art as it is a science. These are tools available for you to use, just like the other tools in your toolbox. And every farmer has to decide how they're going to use those tools. Okay, and then number 3. The third way that you can increase your profitability, number 1, you can reduce your cost. Number 2, you can increase how much you're growing in order to sell. And then number 3, you make what you're producing more valuable. You increase the quality of the production, and then you figure out how to leverage that in the marketplace to get more for it. And I think this is the one that has the most potential in the future for people using regenerative techniques. There's not a lot of people doing this yet. Well, I should say, I think there's a lot of people who are getting better quality production. I don't know that there's a lot of us that have figured out how to leverage that into the marketplace and get more for it yet. But that's coming. So we can have better quality harvested product, better nutrient density if you're growing any type of food going directly to the human consumption, and then we need better market access. So I got just a couple of examples here that I'm going to share, but again, this is one that I think you should just be thinking, challenge yourself with thinking about how could this one potentially work on your operation. If you are truly growing a better product, how can you get more for it? How can you get its value out of it? And maybe that's something that the coalition can help with. I know there's coalitions across the country doing some work in this area. There's other organizations out there. So we just did we call it our Regenerative Nexus Soil Health Summit. We just did one in Omaha. And one of the presenters, this is a beef producer from Indiana, he is taking his beef and he is turning it into snack sticks. Okay, grass-fed beef. He's formed a company and they're making these high-end snack sticks. But when they send that into the lab to be tested for nutrient density, and so this is the grain-fed beef average, this is grass-fed average, and then this is Ripley Cove, it's his company, his farm, and it's all grass-fed. But when they do the analysis, you know, they're finding there's a lot of heavy metals in grain-fed cattle. Calcium, he's higher calcium than even the grass-fed average, much higher. Now, I don't know that I have to dig into why these are zeros. There's got to be some of these in there. But higher levels of all of these beneficial nutrients. But look down here. This is what people are really excited about today. Your omega ratios. Omega 6 to omega 3 ratio, you hear about this all the time. Well, this is why we need to eat wild caught salmon, because it has an omega 6 to omega 3 ratio of 1 to 1. And your body needs both of them, but your body needs them in pretty much equal amounts. The problem is most of our diet right now, you know, is much higher omega 6 to omega 3. So beef, you know, feedlot beef, grain-fed beef, 7. That means there's 7 times as many omega 6s as omega 3s. Wild-caught salmon is about 1 to 1, and they say, you know, that's great. That's kind of a superfood. Well, his grass-fed beef is essentially the same. And so he can take that. He has lab-verified nutrient testing, and now he can roll that into his market saying, eat these beef sticks. They taste better than salmon, and it's going to have the same omega ratio as them. Now, some people would say salmon tastes better. It depends on where you're from. I can tell you this, in Nebraska, you don't get good seafood because we're 1,500 miles from any major body of water. So I guess we're only 1,000 miles from the Gulf of America now. But we don't get great seafood, but we have a lot of good beef in Nebraska. So this is what we're looking for. How can we raise crops, livestock in a different manner to have a higher quality product, and then leverage that into the marketplace to get more for it. The Bionutrient Food Association, and you're going to hear a lot more about this kind of stuff. You're going to hear a lot more about this. They conducted a study on nutrient density of vegetables grown using regenerative agriculture practices on multiple farms. So they looked at 8 different crops, a lot of them, leafy greens and vegetables. But the results showed that on average, regeneratively grown vegetables had 21% more nutrients than USDA averages. So they should be getting 21% more for those products. Wouldn't it be great if we could start selling things based on nutrient content and not just on weight? Because weight doesn't mean anything. The American diet has so many empty calories in it without the nutrients. Now, it'll be really interesting to see with RFK, in as HHS secretary, what can he do with this? He has talked about, giving farmers that want to an off-ramp from the system that they're on into growing more healthy food. This is what he's talking about. I don't know how they're going to do that, but I think you're going to hear a lot more about that. And for those of us who are interested in growing things regeneratively, we need to be thinking about how do we get more money for what we're growing, because it is going to be a better product. So we're going to see a lot better and cheaper testing. We're going to see, I think, within, before, in the next several years, I think we'll see consumers be able to go to the store and have an app on their phone and get all kinds of information about what's right in the county before them. And I told you earlier that people make good decisions when they have good information. I think consumers will make good buying choices when they have good information in front of them. That's not here yet, but that's coming, and we need to be thinking about how that affects our own operations. So, in summary, focus on profitability, not just yield. Focus on how can we cut those inputs, how can we increase yields, and I think the inputs is the easiest one. That's where we should all start. The yield thing, if we can decrease our inputs and maintain yields, that's a win. But then number 3, be thinking about how you can develop markets or market relationships to get more money for the products that you are growing. So I'll just leave you with that slide. This is from one of our customers out in California. That is a couple of her kids. This is a cover crop grown in between her almond trees. And she is capturing premium by growing organic, regeneratively grown almonds and selling them direct to the consumer at a price that is much higher than the market. And so this is what we're talking about doing. So there's my email, there's my cell phone number. You're welcome to contact me at any time. And I will be back up here again later this morning, and I'll be in the field at Zeb's as well. So thank you so much. It's great to be here.